Hey there, mythology enthusiasts. Tonight, we're diving into one of the most uncomfortable truths about ancient Greek heroes. The kind of truth that makes Hollywood scriptwriters conveniently look the other way when they're crafting their next big-budget epic. We're talking about Hercules, the supposed paragon of heroic virtue, and his absolutely catastrophic approach to romance and relationships. Now, before you click away thinking this is just another boring mythology lecture, let me ask you something. What if I told you that the hero you thought you knew, the one who completed 12 impossible labors and saved the world countless times, was actually one of history's most problematic figures when it came to his personal life? What if everything you thought you knew about the noble, righteous Hercules was built on centuries of sanitized storytelling? Because here's the thing, the ancient sources don't lie. And when you actually read what the Greeks themselves wrote about their greatest hero, you discover a pattern of behavior so disturbing, so consistently destructive, that it makes you wonder how this guy became the poster child for heroism in the first place. See, most people know Hercules for his strength, his 12 labors, maybe that Disney movie where he's singing about going the distance. But what they don't know is that between all those monster-slaying adventures, Hercules was leaving a trail of broken lives, shattered families, and traumatized women across the ancient Mediterranean. We're talking about a guy whose idea of romance made Zeus look like a gentleman. And I know what you're thinking. Come on, these are just ancient myths. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because these stories shaped Western civilization's understanding of masculinity and heroism for thousands of years. It matters because we're still telling sanitized versions of these tales to children today. And it matters because when we ignore the darker aspects of these foundational stories, we miss crucial lessons about power, consent, and the difference between strength and true heroism. So tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain on the real Hercules. Not the Disney version, not the Hollywood version, but the version that ancient Greek poets and playwrights actually wrote about. And trust me, once you hear these stories, you'll never look at that muscle-bound hero the same way again. Now, to understand just how badly Hercules handled his love life, we need to start at the very beginning, because even his birth story should have been a red flag for what was coming. Hercules wasn't just any demigod, he was the product of one of Zeus's many extramarital affairs. His mother, Alcmene, was a mortal woman who thought she was sleeping with her own husband. Zeus had disguised himself as her husband, Amphitryon, essentially tricking her into an affair she never consented to. So right from conception, Hercules was born from an act of deception and questionable consent. And if you think that's where the problems end, oh, we're just getting started. Because Hercules inherited more than just his father's strength. He inherited Zeus's complete inability to maintain healthy relationships with women. But while Zeus at least had the excuse of being a god operating by divine rules, Hercules was supposed to be a hero, someone mortals could look up to and emulate. The first major red flag in Hercules' romantic career happened when he was still a young man, barely out of his teens. This is the story that most mythology books gloss over or skip entirely, but it's absolutely crucial to understanding the pattern that would define his entire life. We're talking about his encounter with King Thespius and his 50 daughters. Now, the sanitized version of this story that you might find in some mythology books presents it as some kind of reward or honor. Hercules was supposedly being celebrated for his heroic deeds, and the grateful king offered his daughters' hands in marriage. But when you dig into the older sources, the real story emerges, and it's absolutely horrifying. Hercules didn't marry these women, he didn't court them, he didn't even get to know their names in most versions of the story. According to the ancient sources, particularly Apollodorus and other early chroniclers, Hercules spent 50 consecutive nights with 50 different women, one after another, in what can only be described as a systematic campaign of sexual conquest. Think about that for a moment. 50 women, 50 nights, no courtship, no romance, no consideration for what these women might have wanted, just raw mechanical conquest. And the ancient sources are quite clear that this wasn't some mutual celebration of love or even lust. This was Hercules exercising power over women who had no choice in the matter. The story gets even worse when you consider the circumstances. These weren't willing participants in some ancient Greek bachelor party. They were the daughters of a king who was essentially offering them up as tribute to curry favor with a powerful demigod. In the social structure of ancient Greece, these women had no agency, no choice, no voice in what happened to them. They were property being transferred from father to hero, and Hercules accepted that arrangement without question. But here's where it gets really telling about Hercules' character. The ancient sources mention that some of these women tried to refuse, some attempted to hide, some pleaded with their father to spare them from this fate. And in every case, they were forced to comply. Hercules, the supposed hero, the man who would later be celebrated for protecting the innocent and fighting monsters, was perfectly content to participate in what amounted to organized sexual coercion, and the aftermath, predictably catastrophic. Many of these women became pregnant from these encounters. The ancient sources record that Hercules fathered dozens of children from this single episode, children he would never acknowledge, never support, never even meet in most cases. These women were left to raise the offspring of a demigod with no resources, no support, and no recourse. Some of the children grew up to become heroes in their own right, which the myths present as a positive outcome. But think about what that really means. These were children born from traumatic circumstances, raised by mothers who had been victimized, growing up knowing their father was a famous hero who had simply moved on to his next adventure without a backward glance. The story of the 50 daughters of Thespius isn't just one bad decision in Hercules' youth. It's a perfect microcosm of everything that would go wrong in his romantic life for the rest of his existence. The complete disregard for consent, the treatment of women as conquests rather than people, the inability to consider the consequences of his actions, the assumption that his strength and status gave him the right to take whatever he wanted. And this pattern, this fundamental approach to relationships, would repeat itself over and over throughout his legendary career. Every time Hercules encountered a woman he desired, the same dynamics played out: power imbalance, coercion, conquest, abandonment, chaos. But the story of the 50 daughters was just the beginning. Because as Hercules grew older and more famous, his romantic disasters became more spectacular, more public, and infinitely more destructive. We're talking about marriages that ended in murder, affairs that started wars, and relationships so toxic they literally drove people insane. Take his first official marriage to Megara, Princess of Thebes. On the surface, this looked like it might be different. Here was a proper courtship, a legitimate marriage between equals. Megara was royalty, she had political value, and the marriage served to cement Hercules' status as a legitimate hero, rather than just a wandering strongman. For a while, it seemed like Hercules might have found stability. He and Megara had children together. He settled down in Thebes and tried to live something resembling a normal life. But here's the thing about Hercules. Normal was never really an option for him. His past had a way of catching up with him, and his fundamental inability to control his impulses always bubbled back to the surface. The marriage to Megara ended in the most horrific way possible. In a fit of madness sent by the vengeful goddess Hera, Hercules murdered his own wife and children. Now the myths present this as a tragedy, something that happened to Hercules rather than something he was responsible for. Poor Hercules, driven mad by divine intervention, not his fault, just another trial he had to endure. But when you look at this story in the context of everything else we know about Hercules' behavior, a different picture emerges. This wasn't just random divine punishment. This was the inevitable result of a man who had never learned to control his violent impulses, who had never developed healthy relationships with women, who treated his family as possessions rather than people he loved and cherished. The ancient sources are quite clear that even before the madness struck, Hercules' marriage to Megara was troubled. He was frequently absent, off on adventures and quests that took him away from his family for months or years at a time. When he was home, he was often drunk, violent, and unpredictable. Megara lived in constant fear of her husband's temper, and their children grew up in a household where violence was always just beneath the surface. So when the madness finally came, when Hercules picked up his weapons and turned them on his own family, it wasn't completely out of character. It was the logical extreme of behavior patterns that had been building for years. The only difference was that this time there were no monsters to blame, no external enemies to fight. This time the monster was Hercules himself, And how did our hero respond to this ultimate catastrophe? Did he reflect on his behavior? Did he consider that maybe his approach to relationships and family had been fundamentally flawed? Did he seek help, try to change, attempt to become a better person? Not even close. Instead, Hercules treated the murder of his wife and children as just another obstacle to overcome, another labor to complete. He consulted the oracle at Delphi, was told to serve his cousin Eurystheus as penance, and off he went on his famous 12 labors. Problem solved, at least in his mind. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. Throughout his 12 labors, throughout all the monster slaying and impossible tasks, Hercules continued his pattern of problematic relationships with women. He didn't learn from the Megara tragedy. He didn't change his behavior. If anything, he got worse. During his labors, he encountered the Amazon queen Hippolyta, and their interaction perfectly encapsulates everything wrong with Hercules' approach to women. He was supposed to retrieve her golden belt as one of his 12 tasks. In some versions of the story, she willingly gives it to him, impressed by his reputation and strength. But in other, older versions, the ones that don't try to sanitize Hercules' behavior, he takes it by force. The encounter with Hippolyta reveals everything you need to know about how Hercules viewed women who held any kind of power or authority. Here was a queen, a warrior, someone who commanded respect and led her own people. She was everything that should have impressed and intrigued a genuine hero. Instead, Hercules saw her as just another conquest to be claimed. The ancient sources describe their first meeting in terms that should make your skin crawl. Hercules didn't approach her as an equal, didn't engage in diplomatic negotiation, didn't even try to understand Amazon culture or customs. He saw what he wanted, he saw that she had it, and he decided he was going to take it. The belt wasn't just a golden accessory to him, it was a symbol of her power, her authority, her very identity as a queen. And taking it wasn't just completing a labor, it was asserting dominance over a woman who dared to rule herself. But the real tragedy of the Hippolyta story isn't just what Hercules did to her. It's what happened to the relationship between the Amazons and the rest of the Greek world as a result. Before Hercules showed up, the Amazons had maintained an uneasy but functional peace with their neighbors. They traded, they negotiated, they occasionally fought, but they were treated as a legitimate political entity. After Hercules humiliated their queen and stole her most sacred symbol of office, everything changed. The Amazons became bitter enemies of the Greek world. They stopped trading, stopped negotiating, and started viewing all Greek men as potential threats. Hercules had single-handedly destroyed decades of diplomatic progress because he couldn't be bothered to treat a powerful woman with basic respect. And this pattern of destroying diplomatic relationships through his romantic disasters became a recurring theme throughout Hercules' career. Every time he encountered a woman connected to political power, whether she was a queen, a princess, or the daughter of a king, his inability to form healthy relationships created chaos that rippled out across the ancient Mediterranean. Take his encounter with Iole, princess of Oechalia. This story perfectly demonstrates how Hercules' sexual entitlement escalated from individual tragedy to full-scale warfare. He had heard about Iole's legendary beauty and decided he wanted her for himself. Not wanted to court her, not wanted to win her affections, just wanted to possess her. So he showed up at her father's court and demanded her hand in marriage. Now you might think this sounds somewhat reasonable, a hero asking for a princess's hand, but the ancient sources make it clear that this wasn't a request, it was an ultimatum. Hercules made it abundantly clear that he was going to have Iole one way or another, and her father could either give her willingly or watch his kingdom burn. King Eurytus, Iole's father, was actually brave enough to refuse. He looked at this muscle-bound brute who was making threats in his own throne room and said no. His daughter was not property to be handed over to the first strong man who showed up demanding her. She was a princess of Oechalia, and she deserved better than to be claimed like a prize in some barbaric contest. Hercules' response to this rejection tells you everything you need to know about his character. He didn't accept the refusal gracefully, he didn't try to prove himself worthy of Iole's affections, he didn't even challenge her father to single combat, which would have at least been somewhat honorable by ancient standards. Instead, he left Oechalia and spent months plotting his revenge. He gathered allies, assembled weapons, and planned a full-scale assault on the kingdom. Not because they had wronged him, not because they had broken any laws or treaties, but because a king had dared to tell him he couldn't have his daughter. The siege of Oechalia was brutal even by ancient standards. Hercules showed no mercy to the civilians, no consideration for the innocent people who had nothing to do with the king's decision. He burned the city, slaughtered the defenders, and took Iole as a captive. Not a wife, not a willing partner, but a prize of war claimed through violence and intimidation. But here's where the story gets even more disturbing. Hercules already had a wife at this time. Her name was Deianira, and she was supposedly the love of his life after the Megara disaster. He had courted her, won her from another suitor in combat, and promised her eternal devotion. They had built a life together, had children, and by all accounts, Deianira genuinely loved her husband despite his flaws. When Hercules returned from Oechalia with Iole as his captive, he didn't even try to hide what he intended to do with her. He installed her in his household as a concubine, making it clear to everyone, including his wife, that he planned to divide his time between the two women. Deianira was expected to simply accept this arrangement, to share her husband with a woman he had essentially kidnapped. The ancient sources describe Deianira's anguish in heartbreaking detail. This wasn't just jealousy or wounded pride. This was a woman watching her husband systematically destroy everything they had built together for the sake of his latest obsession. She had forgiven him for his past mistakes, had believed his promises of change, had invested years of her life in trying to build a stable family with a fundamentally unstable man. And now she was being told that she would have to share not just her husband's bed, but her home, her children's future, and her own identity as his wife with a woman who represented everything wrong with Hercules' character. Iole wasn't just another woman, she was a living symbol of his violence, his entitlement, his complete inability to respect boundaries or consider consequences. What happened next shows just how toxic Hercules' approach to relationships had become. Deianira, desperate to win back her husband's exclusive affections, turned to magic. She had been given what she believed was a love potion by the centaur Nessus, who claimed it would ensure Hercules remained faithful to her. In reality, it was poison, designed to kill Hercules in revenge for an earlier assault. Deianira sent her husband a robe soaked with this supposed love potion, hoping it would rekindle his passion for her and make him forget about Iole. Instead, when Hercules put on the robe, it began burning his flesh, bonding to his skin with supernatural fire that couldn't be extinguished. The pain was so excruciating that the strongest man in the world begged for death rather than endure it. Now, the traditional telling of this story presents Deianira as the villain. She's the jealous wife who killed her husband out of spite and possessiveness. But when you understand the full context of their relationship, when you see how Hercules had systematically destroyed her sense of self-worth and security, her actions become tragically understandable. This wasn't a woman acting out of petty jealousy. This was someone who had been pushed beyond her breaking point by years of emotional abuse and public humiliation. Hercules had made it clear that she was replaceable, that his desires mattered more than her feelings, and that she had no real value to him beyond what she could provide for his comfort and convenience. The death of Hercules should have been a moment of tragic recognition, a chance for the myths to acknowledge the destruction his behavior had caused. Instead, the ancient sources present it as another heroic sacrifice, another example of how, even in death, Hercules remained noble and admirable. But look at what he actually left behind. A wife driven to desperate measures and ultimate suicide when she realized what she had done. A captive woman, Iole, traumatized by war and captivity, left alone in a foreign land with no family or support system. Countless children scattered across the Mediterranean, most of whom he had never acknowledged or supported. Former allies who had turned into enemies because of his diplomatic disasters. Kingdoms that had been destroyed because their rulers dared to tell him no. This wasn't the legacy of a hero. This was the aftermath of a man who had confused strength with virtue, conquest with love, and power with righteousness. Hercules had spent his entire life taking whatever he wanted from women, and when they finally fought back, when the consequences of his actions finally caught up with him, he was completely unprepared to face the reality of what he had become. The most tragic part of the whole story is that it didn't have to end this way. Hercules had opportunities throughout his life to change, to grow, to become the hero he was supposed to be. After murdering Megara and his children, he could have sought genuine redemption instead of just completing tasks. After encountering the Amazons, he could have learned to respect powerful women instead of seeing them as threats to be conquered. After meeting Deianira, he could have committed to building a genuine partnership instead of treating marriage as just another form of ownership. At any point, he could have looked at the trail of destruction behind him and decided to become better. But he never did, because the fundamental problem with Hercules wasn't that he was unlucky in love or cursed by the gods or simply misunderstood by history. The problem was that he had never learned to see women as fully human beings with their own desires, fears, and rights. To him, they were prizes to be won, conquests to be claimed, or obstacles to be overcome. And this brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Hercules myth cycle. These weren't just stories about one problematic hero, they were foundational tales that shaped how Western civilization understood masculinity, heroism, and the relationship between men and women for thousands of years. When children today watch Disney's Hercules, they see a story about finding your place in the world, about becoming a true hero through selfless acts and genuine love. But the original myths tell a completely different story about what it means to be a hero, and more importantly, what it costs when society celebrates the wrong kind of strength. Because here's what makes the Hercules myth so insidious. These weren't just entertainment for the ancient Greeks. These were moral instruction manuals. These stories were told to young men as examples of how to behave, what to aspire to, how to treat women and exercise power. And the message they sent was absolutely catastrophic. Think about what a young Greek man would learn from hearing about Hercules and the 50 daughters of Thespius. The lesson wasn't, this behavior is wrong and leads to suffering. The lesson was, if you're strong enough, if you're important enough, if you're hero enough, you can have whatever you want. The story was presented as a reward, a celebration of Hercules' virility and power. Or consider the Hippolyta narrative. The myth doesn't present Hercules' treatment of the Amazon queen as a diplomatic disaster or a moral failing. It presents it as a successful completion of one of his 12 labors. He went in, he got what he came for, mission accomplished. The fact that he destroyed an entire political relationship and humiliated a powerful leader was irrelevant compared to the fact that he completed his assigned task. This is what made these stories so dangerous. They taught generations of men that the only thing that mattered was achieving your goals, regardless of who got hurt in the process. They reinforced the idea that women existed primarily to serve men's needs, whether as wives, concubines, or obstacles to be overcome. And they suggested that true masculinity was measured by your ability to take what you wanted rather than your capacity for empathy, wisdom, or genuine leadership. But the influence of these myths didn't stop in ancient Greece. These stories became part of the foundation of Western literature, art, and culture. They were retold by Roman poets, preserved by medieval scholars, rediscovered during the Renaissance, and eventually made their way into modern popular culture. Each generation added their own interpretations, but the core message remained disturbingly consistent. Even today, you can see echoes of the Hercules approach to relationships throughout popular culture. The idea that the hero gets the girl as a reward for his heroic deeds. The notion that persistence in pursuing someone who has said no is romantic rather than harassment. The belief that powerful men are entitled to multiple partners, while women are expected to be grateful for whatever attention they receive. Look at how many modern action movies follow the exact same pattern as the ancient Hercules myths. The strong, violent protagonist defeats the bad guys and claims the beautiful woman as his prize. She doesn't get much of a personality beyond being attractive and eventually grateful. Her desires, her goals, her own agency in the relationship are completely irrelevant to the story being told. And just like in the ancient myths, the aftermath of these relationships is rarely explored. We don't see what happens after the credits roll, when the adrenaline wears off and these characters have to actually build a life together. We don't examine whether someone who solves all their problems through violence might not be the best partner for a healthy, long-term relationship. But the real tragedy of the Hercules myth isn't just its influence on popular culture. It's how it shaped real-world expectations about masculinity and relationships. For thousands of years, young men have been taught that strength equals virtue, that conquest equals love, and that the measure of a man is how much he can take rather than how much he can give. This mindset created a culture where sexual assault was often seen as a natural expression of male desire rather than a horrific crime, where women's consent was considered less important than men's wants, where marriage was viewed as ownership rather than partnership, where the powerful felt entitled to the bodies and lives of those beneath them in the social hierarchy. And here's the most disturbing part. When women in these situations fought back, when they tried to protect themselves or seek justice, they were often portrayed as the villains in their own stories. Just like Deianira, who was driven to desperate measures by her husband's cruelty and then blamed for his death. This victim-blaming pattern runs throughout the entire Hercules myth cycle. Every woman who suffers because of his actions is somehow made responsible for that suffering. The 50 daughters of Thespius should have been honored by his attention. Hippolyta should have gracefully accepted the loss of her authority. Megara should have been more understanding of her husband's violent tendencies. Iole should have been grateful to be chosen by such a famous hero. The myths consistently refuse to hold Hercules accountable for the consequences of his actions. Instead, they present him as a tragic figure, someone who suffers more than anyone else because of his great strength and the burdens it brings. Poor Hercules, cursed by the gods, driven to madness, forced to complete impossible labors. The women whose lives he destroyed barely register as casualties in his grand, heroic narrative. But what if we told these stories differently? What if we centered the experiences of the women rather than the hero? What if we examined the real costs of this kind of toxic masculinity instead of celebrating it? Imagine the story of the 50 daughters of Thespius told from their perspective. 50 women, each with her own personality, dreams, and fears, suddenly informed that they would be spending the night with a stranger because their father wanted to curry favor with a demigod. Some might have been curious or even attracted to the famous hero. Others might have been terrified. Still others might have been angry at being treated like property. But none of that mattered to the story as it was traditionally told. Their individual humanity was erased in favor of presenting them as a collective reward for Hercules' heroism. They weren't people, they were prizes. And the children they bore weren't seen as individuals who deserved love and support from their father, but as proof of his legendary virility. Or consider Hippolyta's story from the Amazon perspective. Here was a queen who had built a society where women could rule themselves, fight their own battles, and live according to their own values. The Golden Belt wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a symbol of everything the Amazons had achieved, everything they had fought to create and defend. When Hercules took that belt, he wasn't just completing a labor. He was attacking the very foundation of Amazon society. He was declaring that no matter how strong these women were, no matter how well they had organized themselves, no matter how legitimate their authority, he could still take what he wanted from them whenever he pleased. The traditional myth presents this as a heroic achievement. But imagine how it felt to the Amazon warriors who had to watch their queen be humiliated by someone who refused to acknowledge her legitimate authority. Imagine the rage and helplessness they must have experienced, knowing that all their training meant nothing against in strength someone who simply didn't recognize their right to self-determination. And think about the long-term consequences for Amazon society. After Hercules' assault on their sovereignty, how could they ever trust any outsider again? How could they engage in diplomacy when they had learned that even the most celebrated heroes saw them as nothing more than exotic challenges to be conquered? The story of Iole is perhaps the most heartbreaking when viewed from the woman's perspective. She was a princess, someone who should have had some agency in choosing her own fate. But when Hercules decided he wanted her, her own desires became completely irrelevant. Her father's attempts to protect her were swept aside through violence and intimidation. Imagine what it was like for Iole to watch her city burn, her people slaughtered, her family destroyed, all because she had been born beautiful enough to catch the attention of a selfish demigod. Imagine the survivor's guilt, the trauma, the complete helplessness of being torn away from everything she had ever known and installed in the household of the man who had destroyed them. And her whirl imagined having to share that space with Deianira, another woman who had been damaged by Hercules' inability to form healthy relationships. Two women, both victims of the same man's selfishness, forced to compete for the scraps of attention and affection he was willing to offer, while he remained completely oblivious to the pain he had caused. The traditional myth treats this situation as a simple case of feminine jealousy. as if the problem was that women naturally can't get along rather than that Hercules had created an impossible and degrading situation for everyone involved. But when you center the women's experiences, you see that both Deianira and Iole were trapped in a system that gave them no good options. Deianira could accept the humiliation of sharing her husband with his captive, essentially endorsing his right to treat women as interchangeable objects, or she could fight back, knowing that any resistance would be labeled as jealousy and irrationality. There was no path available to her that preserved both her dignity and her safety. Similarly, Iole could try to win Hercules' exclusive affections, knowing that doing so would mean betraying another woman who was also trapped in this situation. Or she could refuse to compete, accepting her status as a possession. Either rather than a person choice meant abandoning her own agency and self-respect. This is what makes the Hercules myth so insidious. They don't just celebrate toxic masculinity, they make it impossible for women to respond to that toxicity in any way that doesn't ultimately blame them for the situation they've been forced into. The myths are structured so that no matter what the women do, they end up being responsible for the chaos that Hercules creates. But here's what's really disturbing about how these stories have been passed down through history. Each generation of storytellers had the opportunity to learn from the previous versions, to recognize the problematic elements and tell the stories in ways that promoted healthier values. Instead, most chose to double down on the toxic elements. Roman poets like Ovid had access to multiple versions of these myths and could have chosen to emphasize the tragic consequences of Hercules' behavior. Medieval Christian writers could have used these stories as cautionary tales about the dangers of unchecked masculine pride. Renaissance humanists could have explored the psychological complexity of characters like Deianira and Iole. Instead, most of these retellings focused even more intensely on Hercules' strength and achievements, while further marginalizing the women in his stories. The pattern of celebrating conquest over cooperation, power over empathy, became more entrenched with each retelling, and this brings us to one of the most troubling aspects of how these myths have influenced modern culture. It's not just that they promoted toxic masculinity, it's that they made that toxicity seem natural, inevitable, even admirable. They created a template for heroism that was fundamentally incompatible with healthy relationships. Think about how many modern stories still follow this basic pattern. The protagonist is defined by his ability to overcome obstacles through force and determination. His relationships with women are secondary to his main quest and are often presented as rewards for his heroic achievements. The women in these stories exist primarily to be protected, rescued, or claimed rather than to be full partners in the narrative. Even when modern storytellers try to subvert these tropes, they often end up reinforcing them. The strong female character who can fight alongside the male hero is still ultimately defined by her relationship to him rather than her own goals and desires. The empowered woman who chooses the hero over other options is still making that choice within a narrative framework that assumes the hero deserves to be chosen. This is why examining the real Hercules myths is so important. It's not just about understanding ancient literature or correcting historical misconceptions. It's about recognizing how deeply these toxic patterns have been embedded in our cultural DNA and how they continue to shape expectations about gender, power, and relationships today. When we sanitize these stories, when we turn Hercules into a Disney prince or a Marvel superhero, we're not just cleaning up ancient mythology. We're perpetuating the same dangerous myths that have justified sexual violence and gender inequality for thousands of years. We're teaching new generations that strength matters more than empathy, that getting what you want matters more than how you get it, and that some people's desires are naturally more important than other people's rights. But understanding these patterns also gives us the power to break them. When we recognize how the Hercules myths have shaped our cultural understanding of heroism and masculinity, we can start telling different kinds of stories. We can create narratives where strength is measured by the ability to protect rather than conquer, where heroism includes emotional intelligence and empathy, where relationships are built on mutual respect rather than power imbalances. The real tragedy of Hercules isn't that he was cursed by the gods or burdened with impossible tasks. The real tragedy is that he had every opportunity to become the hero he was supposed to be, and instead chose to remain trapped in patterns of behavior that brought nothing but misery to everyone around him. His story doesn't have to be our story, but only if we're willing to honestly confront what his legacy has cost us. Because at the end of the day, the question isn't whether Hercules was a hero or a villain in ancient mythology. The question is what kind of heroes we want to celebrate today, and what kind of world we want to build for the people who come after us. And that choice, unlike so many of the choices faced by the women in these ancient myths, is entirely up to us. Now let's talk about what happened when Hercules tried to settle down and be a normal husband. Because if you thought his approach to casual relationships was bad, wait until you see what he did when committed to someone. After the Deianira disaster, you'd think Hercules might have learned something about the importance of fidelity, communication, maybe basic human decency in relationships. But no. Instead, he developed what can only be described as a pathological need to collect wives and lovers like they were trading cards. And I'm not talking about the kind of polygamy that was actually practiced in some ancient cultures, where multiple marriages served political or economic purposes and were governed by established social rules. I'm talking about chaos, pure, unfiltered relationship chaos that left a trail of broken hearts, dead rivals, and traumatized families across the ancient world. See, Hercules had developed this twisted idea that his heroic status entitled him to any woman he desired, regardless of whether she was already married, engaged, or completely uninterested. And unlike his father Zeus, who at least had the courtesy to usually disguise himself or offer some kind of divine compensation for his affairs, Hercules just showed up and took what he wanted. Take his relationship with Iole, a priestess of Athena. Now, priestesses in ancient Greece took vows of chastity. This wasn't just a personal choice, it was a sacred obligation that connected them to the divine. Breaking those vows wasn't just adultery, it was sacrilege. It could bring down the wrath of the gods on entire cities. Did Hercules care about any of this? Of course not. He saw a beautiful woman, decided he wanted her, and that was the end of the discussion as far as he was concerned. According to the ancient sources, he assaulted Iole in the very temple where she served, defiling both the priestess and the sacred space in one go. But here's where it gets even worse. When Iole became pregnant from this assault, she couldn't exactly explain to her community what had happened. A priestess of Athena, pregnant by a mortal man? That was a death sentence waiting to happen. So she hid the pregnancy, gave birth in secret, and was forced to abandon the child in the wilderness to avoid execution. The child, by the way, survived and grew up to become the hero Telephus. The myths present this as a happy ending, proof that even Hercules' most problematic relationships could produce something positive. But think about what that really means. A woman was assaulted, forced to break her sacred vows, terrorized into abandoning her newborn child, and we're supposed to see this as a success story because the kid turned out okay? And this pattern repeated itself over and over throughout Hercules' career. He would encounter a woman, decide he wanted her, take her regardless of her circumstances or desires, impregnate her, and then move on to his next adventure while she dealt with the consequences. The ancient sources record dozens of these encounters, each one following the same basic script. There was Pyrene, daughter of a king in what's now southern France. Hercules was passing through on one of his labors when he saw her at a local festival. She was young, beautiful, and according to the sources, completely terrified when this massive, violent stranger started paying attention to her. But Hercules didn't care about her fear. He took her, impregnated her, and left her to face her father's wrath alone. When King Bebrix discovered his daughter was pregnant by the Greek hero who had already moved on, he was furious. But he couldn't take revenge on Hercules, who was long gone and far too powerful to challenge directly. So instead, he took his anger out on Pyrene. She was exiled from the kingdom, left to wander the mountains alone and pregnant. The myths say she was eventually killed by wild beasts, but not before giving birth to a serpent that terrorized the region for generations. The ancient storytellers presented this as another tragic tale of divine intervention and heroic legacy. But when you strip away the mythological elements, what you're left with is the story of a young woman who was assaulted, abandoned, and ultimately killed because a powerful man couldn't control his impulses. Then there was Astidamea, wife of King Phylas. This one is particularly disturbing because it shows how Hercules' sexual entitlement escalated into full-scale warfare when he encountered resistance. He had come to Phalas's kingdom seeking hospitality, which was a sacred obligation in ancient Greek culture. You were supposed to welcome heroes and provide them with food, shelter, and protection. But Hercules wasn't content with just hospitality. He saw Astydameia and decided he wanted her too. The fact that she was already married, that she was the queen of the kingdom that was hosting him, that taking her would be an unforgivable violation of every code of honor and hospitality, none of that mattered to him. When King Phylas refused to hand over his wife, Hercules declared war on the entire kingdom. Not because they had wronged him, not because they had violated any treaties or customs, but because a king had dared to tell him he couldn't have his wife. The siege lasted for months. Hundreds of soldiers died. The kingdom was eventually destroyed, its people scattered or enslaved. And what did Hercules do with Astydameia once he had claimed her? The same thing he always did. He kept her around long enough to impregnate her, then moved on to his next conquest. She was left to raise their child, Tlepolemus, in the ruins of her former kingdom, surrounded by the graves of the men who had died trying to protect her honor. But perhaps the most revealing example of Hercules' approach to relationships was his encounter with the 50 daughters of Thespius, which we touched on earlier but need to examine more closely. Because this wasn't just one night of bad decisions, this was a systematic campaign that reveals everything wrong with how Hercules understood consent, relationships, and his own responsibilities. The story goes that King Thespius had heard about Hercules' legendary strength and wanted to ensure that his bloodline would be connected to the heroes. So he offered his 50 daughters to Hercules, one per night for 50 consecutive nights. The sanitized versions of this myth present it as some kind of honor, a celebration of Hercules' virility and the king's wisdom in seeking such a powerful alliance. But when you actually think about what this means, it becomes absolutely horrifying. 50 women, each with her own personality, desires, and dreams, reduced to nothing more than breeding stock. 50 nights of what can only be described as organized sexual coercion, with the full approval and encouragement of their own father. The ancient sources make it clear that not all of these women were willing participants. Some tried to hide, others pleaded with their father to spare them. A few attempted to flee the kingdom entirely rather than submit to this arrangement. But in every case, they were forced to comply because they had no legal rights, no social power, and no alternatives. And Hercules? He went along with the entire arrangement without question. He didn't ask whether the women consented. He didn't consider whether this might be wrong. He didn't even bother to learn most of their names. To him, they weren't individuals. They were just a series of anonymous encounters designed to satisfy his appetites and inflate his ego. The aftermath was predictably catastrophic. Many of the women became pregnant, giving birth to children they would have to raise alone with no support from their famous father. Some died in childbirth, their bodies unable to handle the physical trauma of bearing a demigod's offspring. Others were cast out by their families, branded as ruined women who could never marry or find respectable places in society. The children who survived faced their own challenges. They grew up knowing their father was a celebrated hero who had never acknowledged their existence. Some became heroes themselves, which the myths present as a positive outcome. But imagine what it was like for these children, knowing they were the products of what amounted to a systematic sexual assault on their mothers. And this brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of the Hercules myth cycle, how it treats the children born from these encounters. The ancient sources record that Hercules fathered literally dozens of children throughout his career, scattered across the Mediterranean world. But he never took responsibility for any of them. He didn't provide financial support. He didn't offer protection or guidance. He didn't even acknowledge their existence in most cases. These children were left to fend for themselves, raised by traumatized mothers who had to explain why their famous father had never come back, never sent word, never shown any interest in their welfare. Some of these children grew up to become heroes in their own right, which the myths present as evidence of Hercules' greatness. But think about what that really means. These were children who had to overcome abandonment, stigma, and often poverty to achieve anything in life. Their success wasn't because of their father's influence, it was in spite of his complete absence from their lives. Others weren't so fortunate. The ancient sources record numerous tragedies involving Hercules' abandoned children. Some died young from neglect or violence. Others grew up to become criminals or outcasts, damaged by their traumatic upbringings. Still others spent their entire lives searching for a father who had no interest in being found. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. Hercules was completely aware of what he was doing to these children. The ancient sources make it clear that he occasionally encountered his own offspring during his travels. Sometimes they would approach him, hoping for recognition or support, and his response was always the same: complete indifference. There's one particularly heartbreaking story about a young man named Hylas, one of Hercules' sons by a minor princess. Hylas had grown up poor and desperate, raised by a mother who had been cast out by her family after her encounter with the hero. When he finally tracked down his famous father, he begged for just a moment of acknowledgement, a single word of recognition. Hercules looked at this young man, clearly saw the family resemblance, and simply walked away. He didn't deny paternity. He didn't claim ignorance. He just decided that acknowledging his son wasn't worth the minor inconvenience it might cause him. Hylas was left standing there, watching his hero father disappear into the crowd, knowing he would never get another chance for connection. This pattern of abandonment and indifference reveals something crucial about Hercules' character. This wasn't someone who made mistakes in the heat of passion and then tried to make amends. This was someone who systematically used his power and status to take what he wanted from women, fully aware of the consequences, and then refused to take any responsibility for the damage he caused. And the most tragic part is how this behavior escalated over time. As Hercules grew older and more famous, his sense of entitlement expanded. He started to believe that his heroic deeds gave him unlimited license to behave however he wanted in his personal life. Every monster he killed, every impossible task he completed, every city he saved became justification for treating women as disposable objects. By the end of his career, Hercules had developed what can only be described as a harem system. He maintained multiple concurrent relationships with women across the ancient world, visiting them when convenient and ignoring them when not. Some were wives, some were concubines, some were just women he had decided belonged to him whether they agreed or not. These women were expected to remain faithful to him while he traveled freely between them. They were supposed to raise his children, manage his households, and be available for his pleasure whenever he happened to pass through their region. And if they showed any signs of dissatisfaction with this arrangement, if they dared to complain about his absences or his other relationships, they were labeled as jealous and unreasonable. The most disturbing example of this system was his relationship with a woman named Omphale, Queen of Lydia. After the death of Deianira, Hercules was sentenced by the oracle at Delphi to serve as a slave for 1 year as penance for his crimes. But even this punishment became another opportunity for him to exercise sexual dominance over a powerful woman. Omphale was supposed to be his master, someone with authority over him for the first time in his adult life. This should have been a learning experience, a chance for Hercules to understand what it felt like to be powerless, to have your autonomy controlled by someone else. Instead, he seduced her and turned the entire arrangement into another conquest. The ancient sources describe how Hercules gradually took control of Omphale's kingdom while supposedly serving as her slave. He used his physical strength and heroic reputation to intimidate her advisors, seduce her into dependency, and ultimately transform a punishment into a reward. By the end of his year of service, Omphale was completely under his influence, and he had effectively added her kingdom to his collection of territories where he could do whatever he wanted. But the most revealing part of the Omphale story is what happened afterward. Once his year of servitude was complete, Hercules simply left. He had gotten what he wanted from the relationship, had proven that even when he was supposed to be powerless, he could still dominate a strong woman, and now he was bored. Omphale was left to rule a kingdom that had been destabilized by his presence, deal with advisors who no longer respected her authority, and raise the children he had fathered during their time together. This pattern of conquest and abandonment became Hercules' signature approach to relationships. He would identify a woman he wanted, use whatever combination of charm, intimidation, and force was necessary to claim her, enjoy the relationship for as long as it amused him, and then move on without a backward glance. The women were left to deal with the emotional, financial, and social consequences of having been involved with him. And here's what makes this behavior even more inexcusable. Hercules was fully aware of what he was doing to these women. The ancient sources make it clear that he occasionally encountered former lovers during his travels, women whose lives had been destroyed by their relationships with him. Sometimes they would plead with him for support, or beg him to acknowledge the children they had raised alone, or simply ask for some explanation of why he had abandoned them. His response was always the same: complete indifference. He didn't deny responsibility. He didn't claim ignorance. He just made it clear that their suffering was not his problem. These women had served their purpose in his life, and now they were irrelevant to him. The fact that they might be struggling, that their children might be in need, that their communities might have rejected them, none of that concerned him in the slightest. This callous indifference reveals the true nature of Hercules' approach to relationships. This wasn't someone who loved deeply but struggled with commitment. This wasn't someone who made mistakes because he was overwhelmed by passion or confused about social expectations. This was someone who viewed women as consumable resources, to be used up and discarded when they were no longer convenient or entertaining. And the most disturbing part is how the myths present this behavior as natural, even admirable. The ancient storytellers didn't critique Hercules' treatment of women, they celebrated it. His ability to attract and conquer multiple partners was presented as evidence of his heroic virility. His willingness to abandon responsibilities was portrayed as freedom from mundane concerns that might distract from his great deeds. The women who suffered because of his actions were either ignored entirely or blamed for their own misfortune. If they complained about his treatment, they were labeled as jealous or possessive. If they sought revenge, they were portrayed as villains. If they simply tried to move on with their lives, they were forgotten by the storytellers entirely. This narrative framework created a template for understanding relationships that has influenced Western culture for thousands of years. It established the idea that powerful men are naturally entitled to multiple partners, that women should be grateful for whatever attention they receive from high-status males, and that the consequences of sexual relationships are primarily the woman's responsibility to handle. But perhaps most damaging of all, these myths establish the idea that a man's public achievements can justify his private failures. Hercules could treat women terribly, abandon his children, destroy families, and destabilize entire kingdoms. But as long as he kept killing monsters and completing heroic tasks, his personal behavior was irrelevant to his status as a hero. This is the legacy that Hercules left behind: the idea that greatness in one area of life excuses cruelty in another, that public virtue can coexist with private vice, and that the powerful have different moral standards than everyone else. And we're still dealing with the consequences of these ideas today, every time we excuse the bad behavior of celebrities, athletes, or politicians because of their professional achievements. Because at the end of the day, the real tragedy of the Hercules myths isn't just what they tell us about ancient Greek values. It's how they continue to shape our understanding of power, masculinity, and relationships in the modern world. Every time we celebrate someone who treats people terribly but accomplishes impressive things, every time we excuse sexual misconduct because the perpetrator is talented or important, every time we blame victims for the actions of the moral abusers, we're following framework established by these ancient stories. And that's why understanding the real Hercules matters so much. Not because we need to cancel ancient mythology, but because we need to recognize how these foundational narratives continue to influence our culture and make conscious choices about what kinds of heroes we want to celebrate going forward. The influence of these toxic relationship patterns didn't stop with Hercules himself. They created a ripple effect that spread throughout Greek mythology and beyond, establishing what we might call the Hercules standard for heroic masculinity. And nowhere is this more evident than in how other heroes began copying his approach to women, treating his sexual conquests as a blueprint for their own behavior. Take Theseus, the supposed hero of Athens. He looked at Hercules' career and thought, you know what? That looks like a great way to live. Theseus went on to abandon Ariadne after she helped him escape the labyrinth, kidnap Helen of Troy when she was still a child, and assault the Amazon queen Antiope. Sound familiar? That's because Theseus was essentially following the Hercules playbook step by step. Or consider Jason, leader of the Argonauts. His treatment of Medea follows the exact same pattern we've seen with Hercules. Use a powerful woman to achieve your goals, make promises you have no intention of keeping, abandon her when something better comes along, and then act surprised when she seeks revenge. The only difference is that Medea was a sorceress who could actually fight back, which made Jason's story end even more catastrophically than most of Hercules' relationships. But here's what's really disturbing about this pattern of imitation. It shows that the ancient Greeks didn't see Hercules' behavior as aberrant or problematic. They saw it as aspirational. Young heroes weren't learning from his mistakes, they were copying his methods. The myth cycle was essentially teaching generation after generation of Greek men that this was how powerful individuals were supposed to behave. And the women in these stories, they started to internalize these expectations too. The myths from later periods show women who expect to be abandoned, who plan for betrayal, who see being discarded by a hero as just part of the natural order. They stopped being surprised when men like Hercules treated them as disposable and started planning their lives around the assumption that any relationship with a powerful man would inevitably end in abandonment. This normalization of toxic behavior created what we might call a cultural trauma that echoed through generations. Women learned not to expect loyalty, commitment, or basic respect from the men in their lives. Men learned that strength and achievement gave them license to treat others however they pleased. And society as a whole accepted that this was just how things worked. But the real genius of the Hercules myth system was how it made this dysfunction seem not just normal, but heroic. The stories weren't presented as cautionary tales about the dangers of unchecked masculine power. They were presented as celebrations of that power. Every woman Hercules conquered was proof of his virility. Every rival he eliminated was evidence of his strength. Every family he destroyed was just collateral damage in his heroic journey. This framing is what made the myths so insidious. They didn't just describe toxic behavior, they marketed it as the highest form of masculine achievement. They took patterns that would destroy any normal person's life and relationships and rebranded them as the natural privileges of greatness. And nowhere is this more clear than in how the myths handle the concept of consent. In the world of ancient Greek heroes, consent wasn't something that needed to be obtained. It was something that could be overruled by superior force or status. When Hercules wanted something, the question wasn't whether the other person agreed. The question was whether anyone was powerful enough to stop him. This might seem like an ancient problem, something we've evolved past in modern times. But think about how many contemporary stories still follow this basic framework. How many movies, books, and TV shows feature male protagonists who pursue women despite clear rejections, who wear down resistance through persistence, who treat no as just the opening move in a negotiation. The modern version might be more subtle than Hercules literally carrying off women he desires. But the underlying message is often the same. When a man really wants something, the other person's wishes are just obstacles to be overcome. The hero gets the girl not because she chooses him, but because he refuses to accept any other outcome. And just like in the ancient myths, these modern stories rarely explore the aftermath. We don't see what happens to the woman who finally gives in to persistent pursuit after months of saying no. We don't examine whether someone who refuses to accept rejection in romance might have problems respecting boundaries in other areas of life. We certainly don't consider whether these relationships, built on the erasure of one person's autonomy, could ever develop into healthy partnerships. But the Hercules myths go even deeper than just promoting toxic masculinity. They create what we might call a hero's exemption from normal moral standards. The idea that exceptional people get to play by different rules, that greatness in one area of life justifies cruelty in another, that society should tolerate bad behavior from individuals who contribute something valuable. This exemption system is everywhere in modern culture. We see it when talented artists are excused for abusive behavior because their work is considered important. We see it when successful business people are forgiven for destroying lives because they create jobs or wealth. We see it when politicians are given a pass on personal scandals because of their policy positions. And in every case, the logic is exactly the same as what we see in the Hercules myths. This person does important things, therefore their treatment of other people is less important than their achievements. The women, children, employees, or constituents who suffer because of their behavior are acceptable casualties in service of some greater good. But here's what the Hercules myths reveal about this logic. It doesn't actually work. The hero's exemption doesn't create better heroes, it creates more destructive ones. When we tell people that their achievements justify their cruelty, they don't become more achievement-oriented, they become more cruel. Look at what happened to Hercules himself. Early in his career, his problematic behavior was relatively contained. He made bad decisions, but they were individual mistakes that affected specific people. But as his reputation grew, as he became more celebrated for his heroic deeds, his sense of entitlement expanded. He started to believe that his greatness gave him unlimited license to behave however he wanted. By the end of his career, Hercules wasn't just making individual bad decisions, he was operating an entire system of exploitation and abandonment. He had multiple women scattered across the Mediterranean, dozens of children he refused to acknowledge, and a trail of destroyed families and destabilized kingdoms behind him. The hero's exemption hadn't made him a better hero. It had turned him into a one-man catastrophe. And this escalation pattern is something we see repeatedly in modern cases too. When we excuse someone's bad behavior because of their achievements, we're not just overlooking their current actions. We're giving them permission to get worse. We're telling them that as long as they keep producing whatever we value from them, there are no consequences for how they treat other people. This creates a feedback loop where the most successful people become the most destructive ones. They learn that their achievements shield them from accountability, so they stop trying to be accountable. They discover that society will tolerate increasing levels of bad behavior as long as they maintain their public success. So they push those boundaries further and further. Eventually, you end up with people who are completely disconnected from normal human empathy and moral reasoning. They see other people not as individuals with rights and feelings, but as resources to be exploited in service of their own goals. They become, in essence, exactly like Hercules, powerful, celebrated, and absolutely toxic to everyone around them. But the most insidious aspect of the Hercules myth system is how it handles the victims of this toxic behavior, because the stories don't just excuse the hero's cruelty, they actively blame the people who suffer because of it. Every woman who complains about Hercules' treatment is portrayed as jealous, vindictive, or unreasonable. Every rival who challenges him is painted as an obstacle to be removed rather than someone defending legitimate interests. This victim-blaming framework serves a crucial function in maintaining the hero's exemption system. It ensures that the people who are harmed by powerful individuals will be discouraged from speaking out, and that society will be predisposed to dismiss their complaints when they do. It creates a culture where the victims of abuse are seen as the problem, while the abusers are protected and celebrated. We see this same dynamic playing out constantly in modern scandals. When someone powerful is accused of misconduct, the first instinct is often to attack the credibility, motives, or character of the accusers. They're portrayed as jealous, opportunistic, or vindictive. Their pain is minimized, their experiences are questioned, and their right to speak out is challenged. Meanwhile, the powerful person's achievements are held up as evidence of their good character. Look at all the great things they've done, the argument goes. Look at how many people they've helped or inspired. Surely someone capable of such greatness couldn't be guilty of the terrible things they're accused of. This is exactly the same logic that protected Hercules for thousands of years. Look at all the monsters he killed, all the people he saved, all the impossible tasks he completed. Surely someone capable of such heroism couldn't be responsible for the trail of broken lives behind him. The women who accused him of assault must have been lying. The children who claimed he abandoned them must have been mistaken. The rivals who said he was cruel and selfish must have been jealous of his success. But when you actually examine Hercules' story without these protective filters, when you center the experiences of the people he harmed rather than focusing on his achievements, a very different picture emerges. You see someone who used his power and status to exploit vulnerable people, who treated relationships as conquests rather than partnerships, and who left a path of destruction wherever he went. And you start to understand that his heroic achievements and his personal cruelty weren't separate aspects of his character. They were intimately connected. His willingness to use violence to solve problems, his complete disregard for other people's wishes, his assumption that he had the right to take whatever he wanted. These weren't flaws that happened to coexist with his heroism. They were the very traits that made his particular brand of heroism possible. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable truth about the Hercules myths. They reveal that the qualities we often celebrate as heroic, strength, determination, the refusal to accept limitations, can easily become toxic when they're not balanced by empathy, wisdom, and respect for others. A person who never accepts no for an answer might accomplish great things, but they'll also steamroll over anyone who gets in their way. Someone who solves problems through violence might be effective in battle, but they'll struggle to build healthy relationships based on communication and compromise. An individual who sees themselves as naturally superior to others might achieve positions of great power, but they'll use that power to exploit rather than protect the people beneath them. The Hercules myths show us what happens when we celebrate these traits without requiring the moral development that should accompany them. We get people who are incredibly effective at achieving their goals and absolutely devastating to everyone around them. We get heroes who save the world but destroy their families. We get leaders who build empires but leave trails of broken lives in their wake. And perhaps most tragically, we get a culture that sees this as normal, even admirable. A society that teaches young people to aspire to this kind of destructive greatness, that tells them success justifies cruelty, that promises them they can have everything they want as long as they're strong enough to take it. This is the real legacy of Hercules' sexual conquests, not just the individual women he harmed or the specific families he destroyed, but the cultural template he established for understanding power, masculinity, and relationships. A template that has influenced Western civilization for thousands of years and continues to shape our world today. Because every time we excuse someone's personal failures because of their professional success, every time we treat consent as optional for sufficiently important people, every time we blame victims for the actions of their abusers, we're following the moral framework established by these ancient stories. We're perpetuating the same toxic patterns that made Hercules a hero in the eyes of his contemporaries and the eyes of any one monster in the who actually examines his behavior. But understanding these patterns also gives us the power to break them. When we recognize how the Hercules myths have shaped our cultural understanding of heroism and success, we can start making different choices. We can celebrate achievements without excusing cruelty. We can admire strength without tolerating exploitation. We can tell stories about heroes who are genuinely heroic, not just powerful. The question is whether we're willing to do the hard work of examining our own assumptions, challenging our cultural narratives, and building a better understanding of what true heroism actually looks like. Because until we do, we'll keep producing our own versions of Hercules, people who accomplish great things and leave great suffering in their wake. And the women, children, and other vulnerable people in our society will keep paying the price for our failure to learn from these ancient warnings about the dangers of unchecked power and unexamined privilege. The myths gave us the blueprint for this toxicity. The question is whether we're brave enough to tear it up and start building something better. And that brings us to perhaps the most disturbing revelation about Hercules' approach to relationships. The man who supposedly embodied heroic virtue had a nasty habit of turning love into a weapon. Not metaphorically, but literally, he weaponized romance, using his strength and status to force women into relationships that served his ego while destroying their lives. Take his encounter with Hippolyta, the Amazon queen we touched on earlier. But here's the part that most retellings conveniently skip. After humiliating her by stealing her belt, Hercules didn't just leave, he stuck around. And according to some of the darker versions of this myth, he decided that taking her most prized possession wasn't enough. He wanted to take her dignity too. The Amazon culture was built around the idea that women could be warriors, leaders, completely independent beings who didn't need men to define their worth. Hippolyta wasn't just a queen, she was a symbol of everything the Amazons had fought to create and defend. And Hercules, in his infinite wisdom, decided that the best way to complete his conquest was to force this proud, independent leader into a sexual relationship that would utterly destroy everything she represented. Think about the psychological warfare involved in that choice. This wasn't just assault, it was cultural annihilation. Hercules was essentially saying that no matter how strong these women were, no matter how well they had organized their society, no matter how fierce their warriors or wise their leaders, he could still reduce their queen to just another conquest whenever he felt like it. And the aftermath? Hippolyta never recovered from the encounter. The sources describe her as becoming withdrawn, paranoid, unable to trust anyone or anything. The woman who had once led her people with confidence and strength became a shadow of herself, jumping at shadows and flinching away from human contact. She eventually died young, though whether from illness, suicide, or simply the psychological trauma of what Hercules had done to her is unclear from the fragmentary records. But here's what makes this story even more sickening. When the other Amazons saw what had happened to their beloved queen, when they witnessed how this supposedly great hero had destroyed the woman they most admired, some of them broke. A few abandoned their warrior culture entirely, convinced that if someone like Hippolyta could be so utterly defeated, then their entire way of life was pointless. Others went in the opposite direction, becoming so consumed with rage and hatred that they spent the rest of their lives hunting down and killing any Greek man they could find. They turned from noble warriors defending their homeland into vengeful killers driven mad by trauma. Either way, Hercules had succeeded in destroying not just one woman, but an entire culture's faith in itself. And this pattern of using sexual violence as a tool of cultural destruction shows up repeatedly in Hercules' story. He didn't just assault individual women, he targeted the ones whose violation would send the strongest possible message about male dominance and female powerlessness. Consider his relationship with the priestesses he encountered throughout his travels. These weren't just random women who caught his eye. They were specifically chosen because they represented female spiritual authority, women who had dedicated their lives to serving the gods and who commanded respect in their communities. When Hercules assaulted these priestesses, he wasn't just satisfying his lust. He was making a statement about the proper place of women in society. He was saying that no matter how sacred their vows, no matter how respected their position, no matter how close their connection to the divine, they were still just women, and women existed for men's pleasure. The psychological damage this caused extended far beyond the individual victims. Entire communities would lose faith in their spiritual traditions when they saw their most revered holy women reduced to traumatized shells of their former selves. If the gods couldn't protect their own priestesses from a mortal hero, what was the point of worship at all? But Hercules' most systematic campaign of sexual violence was what happened with those 50 daughters of King Thespius. And I want to be absolutely clear about what the ancient sources are describing here, because the sanitized versions of this story have hidden the true horror of what took place. This wasn't 50 nights of romance or even 50 nights of casual encounters between consenting adults. The original text describes something that can only be called an organized rape campaign. 50 women systematically violated over 50 consecutive nights with their own father's blessing and encouragement. The king didn't offer his daughters to Hercules because he thought they would enjoy the experience or because he wanted to honor them with a great match. He offered them because he wanted to breed demigods. He saw his daughters not as people with their own desires and rights, but as valuable livestock that could produce even more valuable offspring. And Hercules? He went along with this arrangement enthusiastically. The sources make it clear that he understood exactly what was happening. He knew these women had no choice in the matter. He knew they were being forced to participate. He knew that many of them were terrified, disgusted, or actively trying to escape, and he didn't care. Night after night, he would take whichever daughter was presented to him, use her body for his pleasure, and then move on to the next one. Some of the women tried to resist, others attempted to hide or flee. A few even tried to kill themselves rather than submit to what they knew was coming. But the king had guards to ensure compliance. The women were dragged to Hercules' chamber whether they wanted to be there or not. They were held down if they struggled. They were threatened with death if they tried to escape. And through it all, Hercules just kept going, night after night, treating their suffering as nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The ancient chroniclers record that by the end of the 50 nights, many of these women had been broken completely. They stopped speaking, stopped eating, stopped engaging with the world around them. They had been systematically dehumanized by someone who was supposed to represent the pinnacle of human virtue and heroism. And the children that resulted from these assaults? The myths present them as a blessing, proof of Hercules' incredible virility and the wisdom of the king's breeding program. But think about what it meant for these children to grow up knowing how they had been conceived. Think about what it did to their mothers to raise constant reminders of their trauma. Some of the women never recovered from the experience. They spent the rest of their lives in a kind of living death, unable to form relationships, unable to trust anyone, unable to find joy or meaning in existence. Others developed what we would now recognize as severe mental illness, alternating between periods of catatonic withdrawal and explosive rage. A few managed to build some semblance of a normal life, but even they carried the scars forever. They flinched away from men's touch, had nightmares that lasted for decades, struggled with feelings of worthlessness and shame that no amount of time could heal. They had been used as breeding stock by a hero, and that experience had poisoned everything else in their lives. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. It wasn't presented as a cautionary tale about the abuse of power or the importance of consent. It was presented as a success story. 50 knights, 50 women, dozens of heroic offspring. What more could you ask for from a legendary strongman? The ancient audiences who heard this story weren't supposed to feel horror or sympathy for the victims. They were supposed to be impressed by Hercules' stamina and virility. They were supposed to admire King Thespius for his clever strategy in securing such powerful bloodlines for his family. The women's suffering was completely irrelevant to the narrative being told. And this brings us to one of the most toxic aspects of the entire Hercules myth cycle: the complete erasure of women's experiences and perspectives. These stories were told by men, for men, about men's achievements and adventures. Women existed in them only as obstacles to overcome, prizes to win, or tools to use. When women in these myths experienced pain, trauma, or loss, it was never the focus of the story. Their suffering was just background noise, something that happened in the margins while the real action, the hero's journey, played out center stage. Their voices were silenced, their agency denied, their humanity ignored. This narrative framework taught generation after generation of listeners that women's experiences simply didn't matter as much as men's achievements, that female pain was acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of male glory. That consent was a luxury that could be dispensed with when more important things were at stake, and nowhere is this more clear than in how these myths handle the concept of revenge. When women in Hercules' story try to fight back against their treatment, when they seek justice or retribution for what has been done to them, they're invariably portrayed as villains. Take Deianira's final act with the poisoned robe. The traditional telling of this story presents her as a jealous wife who killed her husband out of spite and possessiveness. But when you understand the full context of their relationship, when you see how Hercules had systematically destroyed her sense of self-worth and security, her actions become tragically understandable. This wasn't a woman acting out of petty jealousy. This was someone who had been pushed beyond her breaking point by years of emotional abuse, public humiliation, and the constant threat of being replaced by her husband's latest conquest. She had tried patience, tried understanding, tried every conventional way of dealing with an unfaithful spouse. When all of those approaches failed, when Hercules made it clear that he was going to install his war captive as a permanent part of their household whether she liked it or not, Deianira was faced with an impossible choice. She could accept complete degradation and the total destruction of her marriage, or she could fight back with the only weapon available to her. The fact that her weapon turned out to be poison rather than a sword doesn't make her actions any less understandable. In a world where women had no legal recourse, no social support, and no legitimate way to challenge their husband's behavior, desperate measures were sometimes the only measures available. But the myths don't present Deianira's story this way. They don't explore the psychological journey that led her to such a desperate act. They don't examine the systemic factors that left her with no better options. They simply label her as a murderous wife and move on, using her story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of feminine jealousy rather than masculine cruelty. This pattern of victim blaming extends throughout the entire Hercules myth cycle. Every woman who suffers because of his actions is somehow made responsible for that suffering. Every woman who fights back is painted as vindictive or evil. Every woman who complains is dismissed as jealous or unreasonable. The 50 daughters of Thespius should have been honored by his attention. Hippolyta should have gracefully accepted the theft of her authority. The various priestesses he assaulted should have been grateful to be chosen by such a famous hero. Auge should have been proud to bear his child, even though it cost her everything she had devoted her life to. The myths consistently refuse to acknowledge that these women might have legitimate grievances against Hercules, or that their suffering might be worth taking seriously. Instead, they present a world where male desire automatically trumps female autonomy, where masculine achievement justifies any amount of feminine pain, and where women's primary purpose is to serve men's needs regardless of the cost to themselves. This framework didn't just shape ancient Greek attitudes toward gender and relationships. It became part of the foundation of Western literature, philosophy, and culture. These stories were retold, adapted, and referenced by countless later writers, artists, and thinkers, most of whom accepted and reinforced their basic assumptions about male superiority and female disposability. Roman poets like Ovid had access to multiple versions of these myths and could have chosen to emphasize the tragic consequences of Hercules' behavior or to give voice to his female victims. Instead, they focused even more intensively on his strength and achievements while further marginalizing the women in his stories. Medieval Christian writers could have used these tales as examples of pagan moral corruption, showing how the absence of proper Christian values led to the exploitation and abuse of the vulnerable. Instead, many of them simply baptized Hercules as a Christ figure, a noble sufferer whose trials and tribulations made him worthy of admiration and emulation. Renaissance humanists had access to a wealth of classical scholarship and could have developed more nuanced readings of these myths that acknowledged their problematic elements. Instead, they celebrated the return to classical values and ideals, holding up figures like Hercules as examples of the kind of heroic masculinity that Christian Europe had supposedly lost. Each generation of storytellers had the opportunity to learn from the previous versions, to recognize the toxic elements, and tell the stories in ways that promoted healthier values. Instead, most chose to double down on the most destructive aspects of the Hercules myth cycle, creating an ever more elaborate justification for male dominance and female subjugation. And this brings us to one of the most disturbing realizations about these ancient stories. They weren't just entertainment or even moral instruction. They were propaganda, sophisticated, carefully crafted propaganda designed to normalize and justify a particular kind of social order, where some people had unlimited power over others. The Hercules myths taught men that strength gave them the right to take whatever they wanted from women. They taught women that resistance was futile and that their highest purpose was to serve male needs and desires. They taught society as a whole that this arrangement was natural, inevitable, and divinely ordained. But perhaps most insidiously, they taught everyone that questioning this system was not just wrong, but dangerous. The women who fought back against Hercules were punished by the narrative itself, transformed into villains whose suffering was presented as just desserts for their rebellion. The message was clear: this is how the world works, and anyone who tries to change it will be destroyed. This propaganda function explains why these myths have been so persistent and influential throughout Western history. They weren't just stories that happened to reflect the values of their time. They were tools specifically designed to shape those values, to create and maintain a particular kind of social order, and to ensure that that order would seem natural and legitimate to future generations, and they worked. For thousands of years, the basic assumptions embedded in the Hercules myths, that might makes right, that male desire trumps female consent, that powerful people deserve different moral standards, have shaped how Western societies understand gender, power, and relationships. We can see their influence in everything from medieval chivalric romances that celebrated knights who won ladies through conquest, to Victorian novels that portrayed persistent male pursuit as romantic rather than harassment, to modern movies and TV shows where the hero gets the girl as a reward for his achievements rather than because she genuinely chooses him. But recognizing this propaganda function also gives us the power to resist it. When we understand how these myths have been used to justify inequality and abuse, we can start telling different kinds of stories. We can create narratives where consent matters, where women have agency, where strength is used to protect rather than exploit, where heroism includes emotional intelligence and moral development. The real tragedy of Hercules isn't that he was cursed by the gods or burdened with impossible tasks. The real tragedy is that his story became a template for understanding masculinity and heroism that has caused immeasurable suffering throughout human history. But that tragedy doesn't have to continue. We can choose to tell better stories, celebrate better heroes, and build a better world. The question is whether we're willing to do the hard work of examining our own assumptions, challenging our cultural narratives, and admitting that some of our most foundational stories might actually be teaching us the wrong lessons, because until we do, we'll keep producing our own versions of Hercules, people who confuse power with virtue, conquest with love, and achievement with moral worth. And the vulnerable people in our society will keep paying the price for our failure to learn from these ancient warnings about what happens when we celebrate the wrong kind of strength and call it heroism. But the toxic legacy of Hercules' sexual conquests goes even deeper than just the individual relationships he destroyed. Because what we're really looking at here is the blueprint for a particular kind of masculine entitlement that has echoed through Western culture for millennia. And nowhere is this more evident than in how he approached the concept of marriage itself. See, most people think of marriage as a partnership, a mutual commitment between two people who choose to build a life together. But for Hercules, marriage was just another form of conquest, another way to assert dominance over women while maintaining the pretense of respectability. His approach to polygamy wasn't like the structured, rule-based systems you might find in other ancient cultures. This wasn't about political alliances or economic arrangements governed by social customs and mutual obligations. This was chaos. Pure, unfiltered relationship chaos where Hercules collected wives the way other people collect trophies, with no regard for their feelings, their rights, or their basic human dignity. The ancient sources record that Hercules had at least 7 official wives throughout his lifetime, not counting his countless concubines, captives, and casual encounters. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. He often married multiple women simultaneously, creating households that were powder kegs of jealousy, resentment, and competing claims to his attention. Think about what it would have been like to be one of Hercules' wives. You wake up each morning knowing that your husband has other women scattered across the Mediterranean. You raise his children while he's off having adventures with his latest conquest. You manage his household, his finances, his social obligations, while he treats commitment like an optional suggestion. And if you dare to complain about this arrangement, if you show any signs of dissatisfaction with being treated like interchangeable property, you're labeled as jealous, possessive, unreasonable. The problem isn't that your husband is a serial philanderer who treats marriage vows like rough drafts. The problem is that you're not grateful enough for whatever scraps of attention he deigns to give you. Take his marriage to Hebe, goddess of youth, which supposedly took place after his death and ascension to Olympus. Even this divine union, which should have represented Hercules finally achieving some kind of spiritual growth and emotional maturity, followed the same toxic patterns we've seen throughout his mortal life. According to the myths, Hebe was supposed to be Hercules' reward for completing his labors and achieving heroic immortality. Notice the language there, reward. Not partner, not equal, not someone he courted and won through genuine affection and compatibility. Reward. She was payment for services rendered, a prize handed out by Zeus to acknowledge his son's achievements. And what did Hebe get out of this arrangement? The privilege of being married to a man with a documented history of violence, abandonment, and sexual assault. The honor of sharing her divine status with someone who had spent his mortal life treating women like disposable objects. The joy of knowing that her own father had essentially bartered her away to settle a debt to his problematic son. But the myths present this as a happy ending, the natural culmination of Hercules' heroic journey. He gets the girl, achieves immortality, and lives happily ever after in divine bliss. Hebe's feelings about the arrangement are completely irrelevant to the story being told. Her agency in choosing her own spouse is never even considered as a possibility. This pattern of treating marriage as a reward system rather than a partnership reveals something fundamental about how Hercules understood relationships. To him, women weren't people with their own desires, goals, and rights to self-determination. They were prizes to be won, trophies to be collected, rewards to be earned through heroic achievement. And this transactional view of marriage had devastating consequences for every woman who got caught up in his romantic disasters. Because when you see your spouse as a prize rather than a person, you don't feel obligated to consider their feelings, respect their boundaries, or honor your commitments to them. You can see this most clearly in how Hercules handled what we might generously call his marital transitions. When he got bored with one wife or found someone more interesting, he didn't go through divorce proceedings or try to end the relationship honorably. He just moved on, leaving his abandoned spouse to deal with the emotional, financial, and social consequences of being discarded by a famous hero. Sometimes these transitions involved violence. When King Eurytus refused to give him his daughter Iole, Hercules didn't just wage war on the kingdom and take her by force. He made sure his existing wife Deianira knew exactly what was happening. He paraded his new captive in front of her, installed Iole in their shared household, and made it clear that Deianira would now have to compete for his attention with a woman who represented everything wrong with his character. This wasn't just infidelity, this was psychological torture, designed to break down Deianira's sense of self-worth and establish clear dominance hierarchies within his household. Hercules wanted both women to understand that their value to him was entirely dependent on his whims, that their security could be revoked at any moment, and that their only hope of maintaining his favor was to accept whatever degrading arrangements he chose to impose. The result was exactly what you'd expect from such a toxic system. The women in Hercules' life turned on each other instead of recognizing that they were all victims of the same abusive dynamic. They competed desperately for his attention, sabotaged each other's relationships with him, and internalized the message that their worth as human beings was determined by their ability to please an increasingly unpleasant man. Deianira's final act with the poisoned robe wasn't just revenge against an unfaithful husband. It was the culmination of years of psychological abuse that had convinced her she had no value beyond her ability to hold Hercules' interest. When she realized she was losing that battle, when she saw that she was about to be replaced by a younger, more exotic alternative, she became desperate enough to try magical solutions to what was fundamentally a character problem. But here's what makes the whole situation even more tragic. Hercules' approach to relationships was completely self-defeating. His inability to form genuine emotional connections, his treatment of women as interchangeable objects, his refusal to invest in the hard work of building actual partnerships, all of this guaranteed that he would never experience real love, intimacy, or emotional satisfaction. Think about it. When you treat people as possessions rather than partners, when you refuse to be vulnerable or emotionally available, when you see relationships as conquest rather than connection, you cut yourself off from everything that makes human relationships meaningful and fulfilling. Hercules could have physical pleasure whenever he wanted it. He could have companionship, admiration, even worship from the women in his life. But he could never have genuine intimacy because intimacy requires seeing the other person as fully human, with their own inner life, desires, and worth that exists independently of their relationship to you. He could never experience the deep satisfaction of being truly known and accepted by another person because he never allowed anyone to know who he really was beneath the heroic facade. He could never feel the security that comes from mutual commitment and trust because he had taught everyone in his life that his loyalty was conditional and temporary. In pursuing a strategy of maximum sexual conquest with minimum emotional investment, Hercules had essentially guaranteed his own emotional poverty. He was surrounded by people but profoundly alone, celebrated by society but isolate powerful enough to take anyone to give from genuine human connection, whatever he wanted but unable to inspire him what he actually needed. And this emotional emptiness helps explain why his sexual behavior became increasingly compulsive and destructive over time. Like any addiction, his pattern of conquest and abandonment required ever higher doses to provide the same temporary satisfaction. 1 woman wasn't enough anymore. 10 wasn't enough. 50 wasn't enough. He needed increasingly elaborate scenarios of dominance and control to feel powerful, increasingly vulnerable victims to feel superior, increasingly public displays of his sexual prowess to maintain his heroic reputation. What had started as simple selfishness had metastasized into a full-blown pathology that consumed everything in its path. But the most approach to relationships wasn't just what disturbing aspect of Hercules' it did to him, or even what it did to the individual women he victimized. It was how it poisoned the entire social environment around him. His behavior created a culture of fear, mistrust, and competition that made healthy relationships impossible for everyone in his orbit. Women learned not to trust each other because any female friend could potentially become a rival for Hercules' attention. Men learned that violence and intimidation were acceptable ways to get what they wanted from women because the most celebrated hero in their culture used these methods routinely. Children grew up in households where love was conditional, loyalty was temporary, and power was the only thing that mattered. The ripple effects of his toxicity spread outward like poison in a well, contaminating relationships, families, and entire communities. Places where Hercules had spent significant time became known for their die-to-marriage's functional approach and sexuality. The cultural trauma he inflicted lasted for generations, as parents who had been damaged by their interactions with him passed those wounds on to their children. And perhaps most tragically, his behavior became normalized and even celebrated. Other heroes started copying his methods, thinking that sexual conquest was a natural privilege of heroic status. Young men looked up to him as a role model, learning that strength and achievement gave them license to treat women however they pleased. The Hercules approach to relationships became embedded in Greek culture so deeply that it influenced their laws, their literature, their religious practices, and their social customs. What had started as one man's personal dysfunction became a template for an entire civilization's understanding of masculinity, power, and gender relations. But here's what makes this historical pattern so relevant to our modern of these ancient toxic world. We're still living with the consequences masculinity templates. The basic assumptions that drove Hercules' behavior, that powerful men deserve access to whatever women they want, that female consent is optional when male desire is strong enough, that sexual measure of masculine worth, conquest, is illegitimate. These ideas didn't die with ancient Greece. They've been passed religion and popular culture. They show up in medieval down through thousands of years of literature. Law knights win ladies through combat chivalric romances, where rather than courtship. They appear in Victorian harassment. They dom novels where persistent male pursuit is portrayed as romantic, rather than innate modern action movies where the hero gets the girl as an automatic reward for saving the day. And they manifest in real-world attitudes and behaviors that continue to cause immeasurable harm. Every time someone justifies sexual assault by pointing to the perpetrator's achievements or status. Every time a powerful person's pattern of abusive behavior is excused because of their contributions to society. Every time victims' actions of their abusers are blamed for we're seeing the Hercules template in action. The mythology that celebrated his sexual conquests created a cultural framework that makes it easier to excuse, minimize, and perpetuate similar behavior in contemporary settings. When we tell stories that present sexual dominance as heroic, when prizes to be won by worthy men, when we create narratives where women exist primarily as patterns where consent is treated as optional for self-entertaining audiences. We're programming themishly powerful individuals. We're not just... And this programming runs, people don't even recognize it as pro-bial so deep that most somatic. The Hercules model of masculinity has been so thoroughly integrated into Western culture that it seems natural, inevitable, even biologically determined. Boys grow up learning that sexual conquest is a measure of their worth as men. Girls grow up learning that their value is determined by their ability to attract and hold male attention. These lessons are reinforced by everything from playground dynamics to professional hierarchies, from dating advice to marriage counseling, from romantic comedies to pornography. The basic template remains remarkably consistent across all these different contexts. Men pursue, women are pursued, men choose, women are chosen, men act, women react. But understanding gives us the power to break this historical pattern also. When we recognize how deeply the Hercules mythology has influenced our cultural understanding of relationships and sexuality, we can start making conscious choices about what kinds of stories we tell, what kinds of behavior we celebrate, and what kinds of values we want to pass on to future generations. We can create narratives where consent matters, where emotional intelligence is valued alongside physical strength, where relationships are built on mutual respect rather than power imbalances. We can celebrate heroes who protect rather than exploit, who build rather than destroy, who understand that true strength lies in empowering others rather than dominating them. The question is whether we're willing to do the hard work of examining our own assumptions, challenging our inherited narratives, and admitting that some of our most foundational cultural stories might be teaching us the wrong lessons about what it means to be human, to be powerful, and to be worthy of love. Because until we do that work, until we're willing to confront the toxic legacy of figures like Hercules and make conscious choices about what kinds of heroes we want to celebrate, we'll keep reproducing the same destructive patterns in new forms. We'll keep raising children who learn that might makes right, that conquest equals love, and that some more than other people's rights, and the vulnerable people's desires matter people in our society. The ones who don't have the power to protect themselves from modern versions of Hercules will keep paying the price for our collective failure to learn from these ancient warnings about what happens when we confuse strength with virtue and call it heroism. The myths gave us the blueprint for this toxicity thousands of years ago. The question is whether we're brave enough to tear up that blueprint and start building something better. Whether we're willing to tell new stories about what heroism really looks like, what healthy relationships actually require, and what it truly means to use power in service of something greater than our own appetites and ego. Because that's the choice we face every time we encounter these ancient stories, every time we see their patterns playing out in our modern world, every time we have the opportunity to either perpetuate the cycle or break it. We can keep celebrating the wrong kind of strength, or we can finally learn to honor the kind of courage that actually makes the world better for everyone in it. The women Hercules destroy back. The families can't be brought. He shattered can't be made whole. The cultures he poisoned can't be healed. But their stories can still teach us something valuable about the real cost of unchecked power and unexamined privilege. If we're willing to listen, if we're brave enough to change, if we're finally ready to become the heroes these ancient victims deserved but never got. And speaking of revenge, let's talk about what happened when the women in Hercules' life finally reached their breaking point. Because here's the thing about systematically abusing people for decades. Eventually, some of them find ways to fight back. And when they do, the results are usually catastrophic for everyone involved. The pattern was always the same. Hercules would seduce, assault, or abduct a woman. He'd use her for his pleasure, often impregnate her, then move on to his next conquest without a backward glance. The woman would be left to deal with the aftermath, the social stigma, the abandoned children, the psychological trauma, the complete destruction of her previous life. Most of his victims suffered in silence. They had no legal recourse, no social support, no realistic way to seek justice against the most celebrated hero in the ancient world. But a few of them, the ones who had access to power or resources or just enough desperation to overcome their fear, they found ways to strike back. And when they did, the myths suddenly remembered how to portray women as dangerous. These stories that had spent thousands of lines describing Hercules' sexual conquests without a hint of criticism suddenly became very concerned about feminine vengeance. The same narrative framework that celebrated his violence became deeply troubled by theirs. Take the sorceress Medea, who wasn't directly involved with Hercules but learned from his example through her relationship with Jason. After Jason abandoned her for a younger princess, following the exact playbook Hercules had established, Medea didn't just accept her fate quietly. She killed Jason's new bride, murdered her own children to deny him heirs, and destroyed his entire future in one carefully orchestrated act of revenge. The myths present Medea as a monster, a cautionary tale about the dangers of feminine rage. But when you understand the context, when you see how the Hercules model had taught an entire generation of heroes that women were disposable, her actions become tragically inevitable. This wasn't random cruelty. This was someone who had learned the rules of the game Hercules created and decided to play by them. So there you have it, the real Hercules. Not the Disney hero singing about going the distance, not the Marvel superhero saving the world with a smile, but the ancient Greek original who left a trail of broken women, abandoned children, and destroyed families across the Mediterranean. A man who turned strength into cruelty, heroism into exploitation, and love into a weapon of mass destruction. The ancient Greeks gave us these stories as instruction manuals for masculinity and power. We've been following that toxic blueprint for thousands of years, excusing the behavior of powerful men, blaming their victims and celebrating conquest over compassion. But now that you know the truth about history's most famous strongman, maybe it's time to finally tear up that ancient playbook and start building something better. Because real heroes don't leave trails of trauma behind them. They leave the world safer than they found it. Apply yourself. Normal humans don't have mechanical systems designed to sabotage their every movement. Hercules gasped, crawling around on his hands and knees, searching for the flint he'd accidentally launched into orbit. Excuses, excuses. A real hero adapts to whatever circumstances they face. By hour 2, Hercules was lying flat on his back, staring up at the sky through his distorted helmet, seriously reconsidering every life choice that had led him to this moment. The fire materials were scattered across a 50-foot radius. He'd somehow managed to tie himself up in the coordination cables, and Phil was taking notes on what he claimed was breakthrough character development. "You know what?" Hercules announced, his voice muffled by the breathing apparatus. "This is stupid." "Ah!" Phil exclaimed triumphantly. "There's the breakthrough. Recognizing the inherent absurdity of existence is the first step toward true heroic wisdom." "No, Phil, this specific situation is stupid. Not existence in general. Just this particular training exercise that you designed to be impossible. That's the beauty of it. By confronting impossibility, you're learning to transcend conventional limitations. I'm learning that you've completely lost touch with reality and possibly need professional help." Phil's response was predictable, more mystical double talk about the deeper meaning of struggle and the transformative power of artificial adversity. But Hercules had finally reached his limit, not with difficulty or challenge, but with the deliberate pointlessness of everything Phil was putting him through. With a surge of genuine determination, he systematically began removing every component of Phil's ridiculous handicap system. The coordination scramblers came off first, followed by the strength dampener, then the breathing apparatus, and finally the perspective helmet. "What are you doing?" Phil demanded, suddenly looking less confident about his pedagogical approach. "I'm refusing to participate in this insanity," Hercules replied, his voice clear and strong for the first time in weeks. "You want to see me light a fire? Fine." He picked up the flint and steel with normal human coordination, struck them together with appropriate force, and had a cheerful campfire blazing within 30 seconds. "There," he said, dusting off his hands. "Mission accomplished. What's next?" Phil stared at the fire with obvious disappointment. "But you didn't learn anything about overcoming adversity." "I learned that artificial adversity is just another form of waste of time. Real challenges are difficult enough without you making everything unnecessarily complicated." "You're missing the deeper philosophical implications." "No, Phil, you're missing the practical reality that your training methods are counterproductive and possibly designed more for your entertainment than my education." This was the moment when their relationship shifted from dysfunctional mentorship to open conflict. Phil had invested so much psychological energy in his elaborate training philosophies that having a student reject them entirely was essentially a personal attack on his entire identity. "Fine," Phil declared, his face flushed with indignation. "If you think you're so ready for real heroic work, let's put it to the test. Finally, an actual assessment instead of elaborate hazing disguised as education. Tomorrow morning, you're going to face the ultimate trial, the labyrinth of infinite frustration." Hercules should have been worried by the ominous name, but at this point he was just relieved that Phil was finally proposing something that sounded like legitimate hero training instead of psychological experimentation. The labyrinth of infinite frustration, as it turned out, was Phil's masterpiece, a sprawling maze constructed in a nearby valley, filled with traps, puzzles, monsters, and what Phil claimed were authentic heroic challenges, designed to test every aspect of Hercules' readiness for legendary status. "The rules are simple," Phil explained as they stood at the labyrinth entrance the next morning. "Make it to the center, retrieve the golden fleece of heroic validation, and return to the entrance. No time limit, but also no help from me if you get stuck." "That actually sounds reasonable," Hercules admitted. "Oh, and one more thing, the labyrinth reconfigures itself every hour, so you can't rely on memorizing the layout." "Of course it does. And there are guardians at various checkpoints who will challenge you to tests of wit, strength, and character, naturally. And some of the passages are illusions designed to lead you in circles forever. Why am I not surprised? And the whole thing is booby-trapped with mechanisms that will dump you back at the entrance if you make too many wrong choices. Hercules looked at the towering hedge wall stretching out before him, then back at Phil's eager expression. Let me guess, you designed all of this yourself? Every trap, every puzzle, every frustrating dead end. It's my greatest educational achievement. And I suppose you've tested it to make sure it's actually solvable? Phil's expression flickered for just a moment. Well, not personally tested, no, but the design is theoretically sound based on principles of progressive challenge escalation. Phil, have you ever actually completed this labyrinth? That's not the point. The point is whether you have what it takes to overcome whatever obstacles you encounter. So you've built an elaborate maze that might be impossible to solve, and you're using my performance in it as a measure of my heroic readiness? Exactly. Isn't it brilliant? Hercules stared at the labyrinth entrance for a long moment, then back at Phil, then at the labyrinth again. Finally, he started laughing. What's so funny? Phil demanded. Phil, I just realized something important. What? I don't need your validation to be a hero. Of course you do. How else will you know if you're ready? I'll know by doing actual heroic work and seeing if it helps real people solve real problems, not by navigating elaborate puzzles designed by someone who's been living alone in the wilderness for decades and has clearly lost touch with what heroic work actually involves. Phil's mouth fell open. But this is the ultimate test. No, Phil, this is an elaborate art project disguised as an educational exercise. And I'm done pretending that your psychological experiments have anything to do with hero training. With that, Hercules turned away from the labyrinth entrance and started walking back toward civilization. Not because he was afraid of the challenge, but because he finally understood that the real challenge was recognizing when someone was wasting your time and having the courage to walk away. Where are you going? Phil called after him. To find some actual heroic work to do. You know, helping communities solve problems, protecting people from real dangers, using my abilities to make life better for others. The stuff heroes are supposed to actually do. But you haven't completed your training. Phil, I just completed the most important part of my training, learning to recognize the difference between legitimate mentorship and elaborate manipulation disguised as education. You're making a terrible mistake. The terrible mistake was thinking I needed your approval to start helping people. As Hercules walked away from Phil's wilderness camp for the final time, he felt lighter than he had in months. Not because his pack was any less heavy, but because he'd finally stopped carrying the psychological weight of trying to make sense of someone else's dysfunction. The real irony was that Phil's training had ultimately been successful, just not in any way Phil had intended or would ever understand. It had taught Hercules to trust his own judgment, resist manipulation, and recognize that the most heroic thing you could do sometimes was simply refuse to participate in systems designed to diminish rather than develop human potential. Behind him, he could hear Phil shouting something about missed opportunities and character deficiencies and the importance of completing official certification programs. But the words were already fading into background noise, no more relevant to Hercules' future than the sound of wind through empty trees. The sun was rising over the mountains ahead, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and rose. Somewhere beyond those peaks were communities that needed help, problems that needed solving, and people whose lives could be genuinely improved by someone with divine strength and a willingness to use it constructively. That was where Hercules' real education would continue, not through artificial trials and psychological experiments, but through the messy, complicated, deeply rewarding work of actually being a hero in the real world. Phil could keep his wilderness boot camp, his impossible standards, and his elaborate justifications for making people miserable in the name of character development. Hercules had finally figured out what he should have realized months ago. The best training for heroic work was simply doing heroic work, learning from experience and measuring success by the positive impact you could have on others. The training with Philoctetes had been a spectacular disaster, but sometimes spectacular disasters teach you exactly what you need to know, just not in the way anyone expects them to. And as Hercules headed toward his first real heroic adventure, he carried with him the most valuable lesson of all, that true heroism came not from surviving elaborate trials designed by damaged mentors, but from having the wisdom to recognize what actually mattered and the courage to pursue it, regardless of what authority figures might think. In the end, Phil had been right about one thing. The training had been transformative. It had transformed Hercules from a confused young man seeking external validation into a confident hero ready to trust his own judgment and make his own way in the world. Just probably not in the way Phil had intended. But then again, the best teachers are often the ones who show you exactly what not to do, even when they're trying to do the opposite. And for that unintentional gift, Hercules would always be grateful, even if he'd never give Phil the satisfaction of knowing it. The road ahead stretched out before him, winding through valleys and over hills toward distant villages where real people faced real problems that could be solved through genuine heroic action. It was going to be challenging, unpredictable, and sometimes dangerous work. But at least it would make sense. And after months of Phil's elaborate nonsense, making sense felt like the greatest luxury imaginable. As he walked toward his legendary future, Hercules smiled. His real training was finally about to begin. The worst part about finally escaping Phil's Wilderness Academy of Psychological Warfare wasn't the relief, it was the crushing realization that he'd actually learned something valuable despite Phil's best efforts to prevent any genuine education from occurring. See, here's what nobody tells you about legendary mentors who've been living alone in the forest for decades. They develop some truly spectacular blind spots about how normal social interaction is supposed to work. Phil had been so isolated from civilization that he'd forgotten basic concepts like constructive feedback and reasonable expectations and not traumatizing your students for your own entertainment. But in his twisted way, Phil had inadvertently taught Hercules the most important heroic skill of all, the ability to recognize when someone in a position of authority was completely full of centaur droppings and needed to be politely but firmly ignored. As Hercules made his way down the mountain path toward the first village he'd seen in months, he couldn't help but reflect on just how spectacularly wrong everything had gone from the very beginning. The warning signs had been there from day one, but he'd been so eager for proper hero training that he'd ignored every red flag Phil had enthusiastically planted along the way. Take Phil's very first diagnostic assessment, for example. Instead of evaluating Hercules' actual abilities or identifying areas for improvement, Phil had spent 3 hours lecturing him about the 7 sacred principles of heroic breathing. Most people think breathing is automatic, Phil had explained while demonstrating what appeared to be an elaborate yoga routine designed by someone who'd never actually done yoga. But heroes must master the ancient art of intentional respiration. Phil, I've been breathing successfully for 18 years without any special training. Ah, but have you been breathing heroically? There's a difference. Phil's heroic breathing technique involved inhaling for exactly 7 seconds, holding for exactly 14 seconds, and exhaling for exactly 21 seconds, while visualizing your breath as golden light flowing through your body and connecting you to the cosmic forces of justice and righteousness. This is how Achilles prepared for battle, Phil claimed, contorting himself into what looked like an extremely uncomfortable pretzel shape. And Perseus used these exact techniques before facing Medusa. How do you know what breathing techniques they used? Ancient texts, kid. You've got to study the classics if you want to understand real heroism. What ancient texts? Can I see them? Phil's expression shifted to defensive. They're written in Old Heroic, which is a very specialized dialect. You wouldn't understand them without years of linguistic training. Try me. Maybe later, once you've mastered the fundamentals. This was Phil's go-to response whenever anyone asked for evidence supporting his increasingly bizarre claims. Everything was always too advanced for the student's current level, requiring mysterious prerequisite knowledge that Phil would be happy to share eventually, but not right now while there were more pressing matters to attend to. The breathing exercises were just the appetizer in Phil's banquet of educational dysfunction. The main course was something he called fundamental movement reformation, which was Phil's elaborate way of saying, everything you've learned about walking, running, and basic motor control is wrong. The problem with modern heroes, Phil announced while watching Hercules walk normally across the training ground, is that they've lost touch with the primal movement patterns that made the ancient heroes so effective. What's wrong with how I'm walking? Everything. Your posture is too upright, your stride is too efficient, your arm swing lacks mythological authenticity. Phil's solution was to teach Hercules what he claimed was ancient heroic locomotion, a movement style that looked like a cross between a power walk and an interpretive dance routine, performed by someone who was perpetually trying to avoid stepping on invisible snakes. See, you've got to engage your core mythological muscles, Phil demonstrated, moving across the ground in a series of exaggerated lunges and arm sweeps. Every step should connect you to the elemental forces of earth and sky. This looks completely ridiculous. That's because you're still thinking like a mortal. Heroes move differently because they exist in a different relationship with the physical world. Phil insisted that Hercules spend 2 weeks relearning how to walk using this mystical movement system. Every morning began with primal locomotion drills, where Hercules had to traverse the training ground using various ancient heroic movement patterns. There was the Achilles advance, which involved taking enormous theatrical steps while swinging his arms like he was conducting an invisible orchestra. The Perseus prowl required him to move in a low crouch while constantly looking over his shoulders for imaginary aerial threats. And the Jason journey was apparently some sort of nautical-themed walking style that involved swaying back and forth as if he were perpetually on the deck of a ship. "I look like I'm having some sort of neurological episode," Hercules protested after a particularly exhausting session of Theseus threading, which involved walking in an elaborate zigzag pattern while making hand gestures that Phil claimed represented navigating the labyrinth of heroic destiny. "You look like someone who's finally connecting with the ancient wisdom of legendary movement," Phil replied enthusiastically. "I can see real progress in your mythological posture alignment." The worst part wasn't the physical discomfort or even the social embarrassment of moving like he'd been possessed by the spirit of a very confused dancer. The worst part was that Phil seemed genuinely convinced that these movement patterns were essential heroic skills, despite the fact that they made every basic task exponentially more difficult. Try climbing a hill using ancient heroic locomotion. Try carrying water buckets while performing the Hercules haul. Yes, Phil had invented a movement pattern supposedly inspired by Hercules himself, which was deeply weird. Try having a normal conversation with someone while your arms are constantly windmilling through the Perseus prowl position. But Phil's masterpiece of movement dysfunction was something he called combat choreography integration. This was where all the ridiculous walking styles were supposed to transform into fighting techniques through what Phil described as seamless heroic transitions. "Watch and learn," Phil announced, beginning what appeared to be an elaborate martial arts routine performed by someone who had learned martial arts by having them described to him by someone who had once seen a shadow puppet show about fighting. Phil windmilled his arms, lunged dramatically from side to side, spun in circles while making whooshing sounds, and finished with a pose that looked like he was trying to hug an invisible tree while simultaneously shielding his eyes from the sun. "Beautiful," he declared, slightly out of breath. "That's the complete ancient heroic combat sequence. Notice how each movement flows naturally from the primal locomotion patterns we've been practicing." "Phil, that didn't look like fighting. That looked like... I don't even know what that looked like." "That's because you're still thinking in terms of mundane combat. Heroic fighting is more like a sacred dance where you channel cosmic forces through precise physical expression." But where were the actual fighting techniques? How do you block attacks? How do you strike opponents? How do you defend yourself? Those are all secondary concerns. The primary goal is to achieve harmony between your inner heroic essence and the universal patterns of mythological movement. This was vintage Phil, taking a practical question about learning useful skills and transforming it into mystical nonsense that sounded profound but actually meant nothing. He had this amazing talent for making the simplest concepts impossibly complicated, while making complicated concepts sound simple. The combat choreography integration training continued for weeks, with Phil introducing increasingly elaborate movement sequences that were supposedly based on legendary heroic fighting styles. Each routine had a dramatic name and an even more dramatic backstory about which famous hero had used it to achieve victory in crucial battles. There was the Odyssey Overwhelm, which involved a lot of spinning and arm waving that Phil claimed represented navigating through multiple opponents like a ship through stormy seas. The Bellerophon Breakthrough was some sort of jumping routine that was supposed to simulate mounted combat from the back of Pegasus. And the Atlas Adjustment was basically just Phil's attempt to make standing still look like an advanced fighting technique. "The key to heroic combat," Phil explained while demonstrating a move that looked like he was trying to swat invisible flies while doing lunges, "is understanding that physical violence is just the surface layer of a much deeper spiritual conflict." "But what if someone just wants to punch me in the face? How does spiritual understanding help with that?" If you're properly aligned with your heroic essence, opponents will be naturally discouraged from attempting mundane physical attacks. That doesn't sound right. It's ancient wisdom, kid. These techniques have been tested by centuries of legendary heroes. Which heroes? When? Where are the historical records of these combat styles being used successfully? You're getting bogged down in details instead of embracing the larger truths. Phil's response to every logical question was to claim that the questioner was missing the deeper spiritual significance of whatever absurd thing he was trying to teach. It was like arguing with someone who insisted that the best way to learn swimming was through interpretive dance. Any failure to see the obvious connection just proved you weren't enlightened enough to grasp the profound underlying principles. But the absolute pinnacle of Phil's movement-based insanity was something he called environmental integration training. This was where Hercules was supposed to learn how to move through different terrain using specialized heroic techniques adapted to various natural conditions. And there you have it, the spectacular disaster that was Hercules' training with Philoctetes. What started as a quest for heroic education turned into months of psychological warfare, ridiculous movement patterns, and enough red flags to decorate every temple in Greece. Phil's methods were so counterproductive they could have been designed by the fates as a cosmic prank. But here's the twist. Sometimes the worst teachers accidentally give you the most valuable lessons. Hercules learned that true heroism isn't about surviving abuse disguised as training, but about having the wisdom to walk away from toxic situations and the courage to trust your own judgment. So the next time you're stuck with someone who claims their terrible behavior is character building, remember our divine hero and ask yourself, what would Hercules do? He'd probably laugh, pack his bags, and go help some real people solve real problems. And that, my friends, might be the most heroic lesson of all.